So I think asking students to use what they know to write dialogues and work collaboratively. Because one of the pieces of theater is that, and it's one of the biggest pieces that I miss with Zoom is a sense of shared presence physically and collaboration. It's hard. It's harder to collaborate in this virtual format. So asking students to write dialogues together, I think, is a way to start.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Andrew MacDonald discusses his background in bilingual theater and how that informs his approach to language teaching and student support. Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Sam Lupowitz, the media manager of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Angelica Kramer, the LRC's director. Today we are joined by Andrew MacDonald, who is currently a visiting lecturer in French at Bowdoin College in Maine.
Dr. MacDonald specializes in the study of French and Francophone theater and performance.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Andy.
Thank you, Angelica. Thank you, Sam.
So before we dive into all things French theater language performance, please share with us a little bit more about your background and your path with languages.
So I'm a product of the Canadian official bilingualism policy that started in the late 1960s and really got going in the 1970s. I grew up in the province of New Brunswick, Canada, in the city of Fredericton, which is the capital city. And New Brunswick is the only officially bilingual province in Canada. And so as part of my education, French was part of the trip to the grocery store. It was on all the products in the grocery store. There were a couple French TV channels when we got cable. The French is on the radio. French is on the street signs. So French is everywhere, but my family is entirely Anglophone. And I started taking French as a little kid in third grade and then just continued with it. And also, French is on Sesame Street. So Sesame Street, any portions of Sesame Street in the United States that are in Spanish are in French in Canada. So it was very much part of my environment. When I teach French in the United States, it's housed in departments that are often framing it as a foreign language. And my growing up experience in Canada was always that it was the other language. There was some otherness associated with it, but it wasn't foreign. It was definitely part of the landscape and part of the world around me, including kids in my neighborhood whose families were Francophone. And I just kept studying it all the way through high school and thinking, and this is perhaps one of the bigger ironies of my professional life, is that in my head I was thinking, well, I need to keep learning French to be a good Canadian to get a good job in Canada. And the irony has been that I've ended up becoming a French teacher in the United States and not remaining in Canada to use my very developed French. So it's very much part of the political and cultural landscape of Canada that formed me. Like, there's no reason in my family history that should have happened. But because I was growing up in a province at the time where the push towards bilingualism was high, I ended up becoming very bilingual by the time I was in high school, and then just kept working on it all the way through college, master's, and PhD.
Yeah, that's great. So where did the interest in Francophone theater come from?
That started in college. I went to a small liberal arts college in New Brunswick, Canada, called Mount Allison University, in a small town called Sackville. It's right on the border of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And Mount Allison has a really well-known French theater program. It's a French theater company called Tintamarre, run by a professor who's now a professor and emeritus named Alex Fancy. And in my second year at Mount Allison, I ended up in a class with Professor Fancy on using French in oral context, like using French for speaking. So really, what the class was called l'expressivité, and so it was for using French really in conversational settings, learning French phonetics, so you could really get the sounds right. And then he also got us doing theater if we wanted to. So Tentemar ran separate. You never got a course credit for it. It was just outside of class, and it
Yeah.
was completely independent of the classroom in terms of getting credit for it. But it very much as a learning experience, it became this parallel track that I did through the rest of my undergrad. And I think what's important about Tentemar is that it's a bilingual theater troupe. It's not just French.
Oh, cool.
And
Yeah.
I didn't realize how important that bilingual ethos was until I left Mount Allison and left New Brunswick and left Tentemar to go work in other places and just see how thinking in two languages and making room for both cultures and both languages was just part of what we did, so that there would be people on that troupe who were just starting to learn French and were native Anglophones, and some kids who were coming from Quebec who were native Francophones who had good enough French, and we would come together. And so we were meeting across this language divide that has been a big part of Canadian history.
Sure.
And this troupe was really a way for a lot of us to come together and support each other and learn the language of the other and create and have fun. And I fell in love with French through doing theater. That I had been studying it since I was a kid, and it was useful, but I didn't give my all to it until we started doing plays. And a hallmark of Tentemar's work is that they do a fall show that is a collective creation. So Professor Fancy would come in with a theme of some kind that we would improvise around in English and French. And then a show is created out of that material that we then stage together. And the shows are always functioning in both languages. And the opportunity to create and play and improvise theatrically with a whole group of other students in both languages. So you could use as much French as you wanted and use as much English as you wanted, and it kind of all comes out in the wash. And then in the second semester, so in the spring semester, we would do a play from the repertoire. It could be Molière, it could be Jean Anouilh, it could be Samuel Beckett.
No.
And those plays often, an example would be there was a play by Jean Anouilh called L'Alouette, the Lark, which is about Joan of Arc. And it has a lot of British characters in it. It's written in French originally, but what we did is our version, we translated all the British characters' parts into English so that you have the French characters speaking French and the English characters speaking
cool,
English, and then some of the characters could be bilingual go-betweens. So that bilingual ethos really folded itself into a lot of the different performances that we did there. So that shaped my trajectory from there. That's where it started. It's become a lot of other things since then.
Great.
Very cool. Well, so I first met you or became aware of you because when my brother was an undergrad, he took classes with you at Dickinson College. And I remember first seeing you, I believe it was the end of his senior year there. The two of you collaborated on a theater piece that was all in French about the study abroad experience and cultural immersion. And I remember being fascinated by that. And I'm wondering how typical that sort of process, that kind of method of assessment is for you, working with student creativity and what you can tell me about that as far as your pedagogy.
From a pedagogical point of view, I wish it was more common than it is. You need sort of particular circumstances and needs of a curriculum of a department, for example, to show up to make room for a theater project to happen.
Yeah.
And the case of the work that I did at Dickinson College on students coming back from abroad was set up in the context of a couple of classes that I did there in theater at an advanced level. And I became very interested and still am really interested in how theater and performance can be used for communities to address any number of issues. I've done work as well as a musician with playback theater, which is a form of improvisational theater where a host will get stories from the audience, and then a troupe of performers who are on the stage will play back the stories that are given to the host by a member of the audience. And that can often be used to reflect back to a community the stories of their community. And what I was really interested in at Dickinson College in particular was seeing many students coming back from abroad, having studied for a year or a semester, and seeing that they were really being plunged back into their life on campus without much time to reflect
Yeah.
on their experience that they just had. There's often a pretty significant cultural, emotional, linguistic, academic experience, and in a very emotional experience, a very moving, very challenging time, and they're just expected to get back in the regular American flow of things and not address it. And so Sam, your brother became part of an individual and independent study project. There was a version of work that I had done as a class project a year or two before your brother was a student of mine. And so it was something I became interested in as a tool for helping students play with and create around their learning experience so that they get to not just have their study abroad experience, but then reflect on what it means, reflect on what they're going to keep, reflect on what they learned, so that that reflection becomes an additional piece of the learning. And linguistically as well, it gives the student an opportunity to create. I haven't gotten a whole lot of opportunities to use that lately. I have a couple contexts in which I've done things that are similar. I've had students write short plays or stories about life experiences. And more recently at Bowdoin College, anyway, I give students the option of doing a creative final project or a scholarly final project, so they have a choice. And so I've had students do writing projects that reflect a personal approach. And I think, particularly if we're not training all of our students to go off and become master's and PhD level scholars in literature,
Yeah.
a creative project might be a good way to integrate their learning in a more lasting way, in a way that has resonance for them, that's going to stick with them. Because the level, when I have had students do creative projects for me, the level of personal investment is much
Yeah.
higher than
Yeah.
just a paper for a final credit.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can second that from my experiences. When you let students be creative, it's amazing what they can come up with. Are there elements of your more theater-oriented classes that inform your pedagogy when you teach a quote-unquote traditional language class?
I think there are in that I think of being in the classroom as a space where performance is always part of it. You're playing a role, and
Sure.
you are becoming somebody else, whether you like it or not. If you're in a beginning language class, you're learning dialogue, you're repeating it, and you're practicing it, and you're definitely not yourself.
That's
Those
that's
beginning
a good
language
point. Yeah.
classes, it's such an alienating experience for a beginning language student because who they think they are at 18,
Yeah.
20, and I have older language learners too who I work with, that all of your life experience that you have and all the smart things you know how to say go out the window when you're in a beginning language
Yeah.
class, and you can only say, je m'appelle Andy, or j'ai 15 ans, ou je suis Canadien. You can only say a couple things, but you need to learn your lines, and you need to be able to say them with conviction, and accept that you're not going to be yourself. You're going to get to be somebody else. And that, I think, accepting it as a role is maybe an easier way to deal with it. I'm just going to go be somebody else for an hour 3 days a week.
Yeah.
I think also for me, a thing that I do value from theater that I also bring to the beginning language classes and intermediate language classes too is the importance of speech, the orality of it, the importance of speaking, of getting your mouth around words and
Yeah.
actually working with phonetics. I love the International Phonetic Alphabet for that. I love writing out the sounds of French for students, because I think the biggest challenge of French as a language for many students is the profound gulf between how words are written and which sounds are generated by which letter combinations.
Yep.
And so theater is just a lovely way, and even just repeating phrases is a lovely way to get your mouth around it, and developing new kind of neuromuscular habits, because they're so challenging. There are sounds, there are vowels you have to make that don't exist. There are consonants that you don't have to make in English, you have to make in French. And theater, rehearsal, practice, that approach to it helps the act of speaking become easier.
Yep.
Perfect. Well, so to sort of follow up on that, we've talked a lot over the last year and a half with language instructors about the way they adapted to virtual learning during the first chunk of the pandemic. And I'm wondering, for you, with sort of a very interactive process and a theatrically motivated process, if adapting was different for you than some of your colleagues, or if it influenced your teaching in any unique ways relative to some of the others.
I think and I love the fact that we're doing this on Zoom too, because it's kind of, you're asking the question and we're doing the thing itself.
Yeah.
I've become very used to it. I think that for me, the leap from screen as performance and stage as performance, classroom and performance is not a huge leap for me personally. I think my students may show up on Zoom with different attitudes to it, but I know that the persona that I use to kind of sell a class on Zoom, which I think is important. I think Zoom, I work hard on Zoom, but I have to stay inside my box. I can't, I'm in here. Something that on the podcast you won't be able to see this, but something that I've worked with, because I have done some performance workshops in English, but with both as a facilitator and as a participant, working with Zoom. And one of the things with Zoom is that we forget that when we're sitting here in our chairs with our cameras, that we have a space behind us. And so that we have distance and we have depth. And there are times when theater and performance is a spatial activity. And trying to remind people that actually this little rectangle has depth and has space. That I like being able to play with that with Zoom, and that's become one of my assets. I think one of the things I'm experiencing right now at Bowdoin College is that we're teaching with masks in the classroom, and so it's really hard. It's hard to speak a foreign language when you've got a mask on, particularly when you're trying to learn what you're supposed to do with your mouth. So I realized that when I go back in the classroom wearing my mask, I've got my body back. And so I can navigate in the room and kind of work with physical bodily expression to kind of engage the students, but my face is gone. And when I'm on Zoom, you can't have my body engaged. I'm basically a torso, maybe some arms and hands occasionally, but I'm a face. And I think Zoom has been a place where I've emphasized one-on-one conversation, I've emphasized little dialogues, I've emphasized, I think the connection between written language and how it sounds has become stronger for me on Zoom. Like I'll tend to put up a document along with what I'm writing, and I'll be writing as I'm listening to students, and they can see words. So trying to shore up that connection between what you're seeing and what you're hearing has been part of Zoom. I think from the sort of theatrical side of it, for me, it's mostly it's the enthusiasm of being in the camera, of being here and being a presence. How can we approximate presence through this thing? And as language teachers, I think that presence, listening, speaking, paying attention to each other is one of the most valuable things we can give the students, because they're learning to communicate. And I think above all, being able to communicate is being able to be present and pay attention to what's going on right now.
Nope.
And on Zoom, how we do that, how present can we get is it's the daily struggle.
Indeed, indeed. So what advice would you give to instructors who are interested in incorporating target language theater into their curriculum? Like, where can they start if they don't have much experience themselves?
I think it's keep it simple. Keep it simple. Is that the first place theater is a back and forth conversation, and you can write them. I think asking students to write dialogues is a really great way to get into that. First, I have some very memorable experiences from my time in French class in middle school, where we had to write dialogues in class, and they got ridiculous. And I'm sure the teacher was sometimes horrified, but we were very engaged in what we were doing because we were given pretty large creative free rein to do that. So I think asking students to use what they know to write dialogues and work collaboratively, because one of the pieces of theater is that, and it's one of the biggest pieces that I miss with Zoom is a sense of shared presence physically and collaboration. It's hard. It's harder to collaborate in this virtual format. So asking students to write dialogues together, I think, is a way to start. If you're wanting texts, I think it's very particular from language to language which texts you think are appropriate. Sometimes the places that I actually find the most effective things to read if students want a dialogue is actually adapting dialogue out of prose texts like short stories or novels. Sometimes short exchanges. Just recently in a senior seminar I'm teaching at Bowdoin, we're taught a long novel, but there's one scene where there's a really wonderful 2-page conversation that happens, and we divided the class up where I had two readers for the 2 parts, and then another student reading the narration. And it was just lovely to have a dialogue, even out of a novel, read back and forth as a little play, because you got a sense of like, oh, that's what's going on. That's what the tension is here. So I don't think student or teachers who want to use theater have to be limited to just finding dramatic texts. I think you can find texts where there are other dialogues and use them. Or have students create their own, which is super easy. And they can be easy. And it's okay to have easy dialogues.
Yeah.
And in some ways I think when you give students the opportunity to take an easy dialogue and practice it and then do it, and one of the pieces that Zoom gives us is that people can record things and play them back and submit a video as an assignment, that the students get to practice and then do it, and they get that sense of perfection. And there's something in the repetition of getting the student to practice the language so they get it right. They're going to feel greater ownership of it, and they're going to feel more confident about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Terrific. Well, this has been a great chat. Before we sign off, we'd like to ask you to share your favorite word in a language you speak, love, or are learning. What is that favorite word?
I'll say my favorite word in French is the word libellule. Libellule. It means dragonfly. And it has, what I love about it, to say it, is that it has all those L's. There's a B in there, but it's a lot of L's. Libellule. And it has an E, an A, and an U. And that U, ule. Libellule. It's, as an Anglophone, for me, it feels very strange in my mouth. It feels beautiful, because that ule, I don't have U in English. The L has the L has a softer quality in French. So libellule. There you go. Libellule, dragonfly.
I love it. That's a good one in English, too.
Yeah, libellule. It's a good one.
Well, Andy, thanks so much for speaking of language with us today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Next week, we have Ken Roberts and Soledad Chango on our podcast.
They will speak with us about the new Quechua program at Cornell.
Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
or follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.